Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Johns, and I'm here to present to you on additive manufacturing and supply chains. So thank you very much for joining me wherever you are. I'm just going to share my screen now and bring up the presentation. So again, thank you very much for joining me. I work at the School of Management at the University of Bristol in the UK, and I'm a management and geographer specialist, and my PhD was many more years ago than I care to admit, but that was looking at creative industries, why they cluster, and the power relationships between suppliers in that industry. And that's led me over years to look at different industry sectors, to look at supply chains, production networks, global operations of companies, and looking at issues around entrepreneurship and technology in firms as well, which is what led me into my interest in additive manufacturing, around the technological capabilities and really interrogating some of this work that we're hearing a lot about, the rhetoric, and busting a lot of myths around the transformational capabilities of 3D printing. And I've taken a more industrial focus looking at additive manufacturing in recent years. So what I wanted to do today was to use some of the expertise I've gained in the last few years with my engagement in additive manufacturing. I have an academic advisory role with the GTMA, a UK trade association representing toolers, and also through the Reshoring UK initiative, which I'll talk more about later when we talk about shifting geographies of production. I also hold a committee role with AMUG, the Additive Manufacturing Users Group, which I'm sure some of you will be familiar with. So I'm delighted to be presenting at Formnext as somebody who has attended many times. I'm glad to be engaging through the conference. So I really wanted to highlight some of the broader context at the moment, the context in which additive manufacturing is being discussed, not only in the business world, but also in terms of the public and how the public is understanding changing technologies. This little word cloud here shows some of the terms and some of the ways in which additive is included and bundled up in this future vision of the factory of the future, of automated production, the factory in which everything will be different with less labour, and also potentially a different geography to those where those factories are, whether they might be more distributed, and what that means in terms of additive manufacturing sitting alongside other forms of technology, robotics, more automation, but also thinking about the role of big data, for example, and the capability of machines to speak to each other. Now, this is all significant because this is being debated at the national scale. We know that there's initiatives from different countries investing in new technologies, including AM. But I highlight here the meeting in Davos in 2019, in which a globalization 4.0 was discussed, the fourth industrial revolution, this era in which how we manufacture will be different. And this is important for this community to understand that really quite a lot of emphasis and importance is being placed on additive manufacturing as a technology to solve some of our current future problems. This comes, of course, Davos before COVID-19, and we now see a renewed interest because of the pressure placed on supply chains, a lot of conversations about the rupturing of supply chains, and also conversations about potential huge shifts in the global geographies of where products are manufactured. Hence this picture here about a shift from manufacturing in the Far East back to advanced economies such as Germany, the UK, and America, for example. So I situate the additive manufacturing industry in this broader context in order to help us understand how that translates into what additive manufacturing does and how we can really strengthen the position of additive manufacturing in a policy sense as well. I see a specializing, maturing industry. There's some industry restructuring occurring around merger and acquisition and tendencies towards vertical integration. We also see, as an industry matures, an influx then of supporting professional services. So we don't have an industry necessarily solely dominated by engineering expertise. We're also now having lots of other professional services coming in, which is good. It's strengthening the sector. But we also have to make sure that those people coming in have what I would consider a realistic understanding of additive manufacturing and what we can expect from the sector. And that as well, to me, necessitates more cross-disciplinary interest and debate Hence my involvement as somebody who's coming from social sciences, and I'm working with engineering colleagues at the University of Bristol and also doing a lot of industry engagement. I see one track in the public sector towards hype and misconception. A lot of that hasn't gone away, even though we know that many things are overhyped and unrealistic. But within the academy, mainly outside STEM subjects, we're seeing little awareness of the sector, still talked in very simplistic terms in terms of the transformation of 3D printing. So more realistic work is needed, and that's something that I'm trying to do and have been doing for several years. So what I wanted to do today was to introduce a broad framework that is a tool that I use in order to understand the composition of the sector, how the sector is operating, and how it impacts on other manufacturing activities. This is a global value chain approach. Any of you that maybe have MBAs probably would have heard of Michael Porter's value chain, and it's a way of segmenting industries and understanding the progression of how a product is produced. It's not a supply chain management approach, although there is a lot of very good work going on in supply chain management that tends to look at the supply chains of individual firms, and there is dialogue between my disciplines around this. But this global value chain is aggregating individual supply chains. So we can look at industries and we can also look at particular commodities. And when we start to do that and understand these different segments, we can then focus on where value is generated or extracted in each stage. This also helps us understand where power is exercised. There's often a relationship between that power and the value, and who's driving these global value chains. And that also leads us to thinking about what activities are happening where, and the nature of those activities and how plugged in they are into local ecosystems, local supply chains, and local regulations. So it provides us with this broad framework, and what I'm going to do in this presentation is apply that to additive manufacturing, also think about how AM can impact on the manufacturing sector before looking at how that can impact the geographies of production. So here I've produced a very simple diagram that has absences, but there's to give the general idea of the different stages in the additive manufacturing global retail chain. And we go from design right through to retail to the end of the chain. And retail can take many different forms, perhaps not the right terminology always, but we can see a pre-production, production, post, assembly and distribution. And this enables us to look at all the different specialist inputs and to understand how they connect into each other. It allows for a few observations to be made then about the AM sector and its dynamics and how it might be changing. A key question is where value is generated. Now, for somebody who's not on the inside and generating pricings for customers, we have to piece together what we know from speaking to people, and costings are very opaque. It's very hard to pin down. So being able to quantify a lot of this is difficult if you don't have the necessary data, which is another sign that when the industry becomes more mature, we may see more different types of data emerge. What we do know is that value is generated unevenly across the value chain, which is typical for value chains. It would be unusual to see equal amounts of value generated. And we see a lot of value extracted by the producer, the machine manufacturer, or the service bureau, but this can change upon application. Taking this value chain approach and understanding that where the value is generated can be opaque is also leading us to see a rise of full service providers who are able to operate across the whole vertically integrated value chain and can also then actually obscure and disguise where some of the costs can be particularly high and distribute those across the whole value chain. Thinking about who's driving the value chains, we see a lot of innovation in materials, which is placing quite a lot of importance on material manufacturers. We also see a key role of the machine manufacturers, and also can place the chain in this broader ecosystem, because we also do see an important role of regulators and qualifiers, for example, in terms of the technology and what is allowed to happen and how the technology can expand. So another question then, which is what I'm going to turn to in a moment, is what then are the underlying geographies of these activities, and how do we know what is happening where, and how might AM change that? Before I do that, and the consideration is about additive manufacturing and how it is impacting on manufacturing sector in general. And this is what my academic colleagues want to understand. If they're working on particularly manufacturing sectors, they want to understand how additive manufacturing is going to influence that. So at the moment, that's what I'm writing for them. And I'm really emphasizing for them how design for AM can make firms can consider the whole value chain. I think that's a key message that we're beginning to realise in the sector, is that actually articulating to people about the costs of additive manufacturing is very narrow-sighted to just look at the production of one particular item. It's actually about the lifetime of that item and what else it might be contributing to for that manufacturer. If we look at pre-production, we know that additive is firmly, squarely important in prototyping and has been for quite some time. But when I go on to talk about different geographies, we can see that by eliminating tooling and reducing the time to production, we can often collapse the geographies of that process and question whether we have to go to the Far East for prototyping and tooling. If we look at the production stage, we can see changes for manufacturers around customization, shorter production runs, faster innovation, and a question around where we actually locate that production. Distribution and retailing, there's a box around this because this is where much of the debate in social sciences lies, around the distance between the consumer and the producer. And lots of predictions about a collapse of that, and that production will locate much closer to the producer. The term prosumer exists, where the consumer will produce their own goods, which removes distribution and retailing and goes straight to consumption. And there's also a lot of rhetoric then around the increased role of the consumer in terms of producing their own designs. So this is really where we're at trying to understand AM's impact on manufacturing and its potential for changing where we produce things. So the current picture then really is around the relocation of activities. There's a lot of talk, but there's also a lot of uncertainty. And a lot of that is exacerbated by COVID-19. Some awareness of the vulnerability of supply chains and the potential role of additive in helping to reduce that. And clearly additive isn't the only actor in reducing uncertainty. We know that there was a big shift, this new international division of labour that happened as a result of globalisation, where a lot of manufacturing located in the Far East. And we've seen a pushback with a lot of hype around claims that that's going to relocalise, reshore and come back to advanced economies. And that is often contextualised in political discussions around how to become more sustainable and how national economies can become more secure in their production and serving their domestic customers by producing locally. And I want us to be aware that that is very highly politicised, and that has influences on how we actually see the realities of what's happening. So there is discussion around reshoring, which I'm going to focus on in a moment, distributed manufacturing, the relocalization of production closer to the consumer, and also dual sourcing. And here, often dual sourcing is where firms will have more vulnerable, more risky international supply chains, but also backed up by closer domestic sourcing strategies. So they will use both side by side. And of course, all of these three can overlap and can occur at the same time. And often what we don't realise when we're listening to politicians or policymakers often is that it's not one or the other. Often firms and sectors will be using multiple strategies, and that will confuse the picture for those of us who are trying to understand it and work in it. So we know some of the motivations, which I'll come to, around why firms might relocate their production, but we're less clear on what the implications of that might be. So reshoring then, it's a term that we've heard a lot of. We will go on to hear more of it, but AM has expected to have a crucial role in this because it's expected not only to transform how products are made, but where, and this rhetoric around its capability to transform the geographies of products, not only where they're designed, prototyped, produced and distributed. And at the moment, we're hearing quite a lot of well-publicised reports about big name companies that are bringing some production back to the home market. GE, Caterpillar, Dow Chemicals, Ford, Bosch, Philips, Hornby, Raspberry Pi. Those are just some that come up the minute you start looking. And other big initiatives announced, like Walnut's 10-year pledge to buy 250 million worth of manufactured goods from the US by 2023. A US reshoring initiative reports that there's 350,000 jobs have reshored to the US, of which 59% came from China and 18% from Mexico. Now, that is about the extent of some of the data that exists on this, and we have to look at the methodologies underpinning it. But we can see a push in discussion. And also here, Japanese example, the Financial Times reported $2 million investment, $2 billion in companies to subsidize diversifying or reshoring supply chains. So a big national push is here, partially in response to some of the uncertainty around COVID, but much of this predates COVID as well. But the policy initiatives might exist, the motivations for it exist, but there's not really much understanding about why firms would do it and what the implications are. And a lot of this is exacerbated by a lack of data. Now, for companies, there's quite a lot of drives to reshore, as much as there are drives to outsource to low-cost economies. There's been increasing visibility of the cooling of offshoring, because more firms are now willing to admit some of the failures around that and knowledge that it isn't always successful. So a lot of the methodologies that are used in order to make the calculations around production location decisions, there's misunderstandings of the total cost of international manufacturing, and that some failure can result from that. Those modelling techniques and that decision making is sometimes incorrect, and it can be oversimplified. And there is a sense of doing it because everyone else is doing it. And the fourth point will speak very much to this audience around concerns around quality control, meaning that production can be relocalized in order to have greater control over quality. But also increased awareness, exacerbated since COVID, around the vulnerability of geographically extensive supply chains. So that's the context, the drive for reshoring. What we actually see in reality is a much more complex picture, and we need to understand this to really understand what the role of AM could be. So there's different factors based on the industry sector, production volumes, and the type of pre-existing supply chains. So we see variation, sectoral variation. There's significant differences in the likelihood or potential to reshore based on the manufacturing product. And also the intense and the level of complexity of the existing supply chains can be relatively hard to unpick, and a wholesale movement of all of that complexity to another location, another assembly location, can sometimes be rather daunting. So at the moment, we are tending to see very specific things that are reshored, and they may only be one part of a bigger assembly. Production volumes as well. At the moment, we're mainly seeing small-scale bespoke production remaining in advanced economies. But a key thing I wanted to highlight here is that this often is new activity, new designs, new products that are staying in advanced economies rather than going to the Far East. So this picture of clawing back a lot of existing manufacturing to advanced economies isn't really being realised as much as we might assume from what we're reading in the media and in industry. And also, reshoring isn't itself a universal process, and it varies based on whether the companies keep producing in-house or whether it's outsourcing. So future scenarios are unlikely to involve the direct relocation of manufacturing activities on a like-for-like basis. Now, this to me creates a significant window, because it tells us that we're not going to just pick up manufacturing and move it back home, wherever home is. We're actually going to see changes in how things are made, and that creates significant opportunities for additive manufacturing, because it's a change in the status quo and it opens up those windows of opportunity. So like we know, additive manufacturing and its impact and its suitability varies by sector, and we know that the value of additive manufacturing isn't uniform across different sectors. We're also going to see an impact that varies in terms of these shifts in where things are being produced. So I think we're going to end up with a very complex picture of reshoring, of distributed manufacturing and dual sourcing, and they will be mixed together. And that complexity will create challenges, particularly for policy making and for manufacturing. But there is a clear role for additive in all three of those scenarios and in the mix of those scenarios. there's a big push from business saying, how do we mitigate against, how do we offset the costs of reshoring? And they often turn to automation, but there's clearly a role for additive manufacturing there. There's significant work going on with bodies such as Reshoring UK, who I've been working with. And part of that is around increasing awareness of the domestic capabilities for manufacturing and finding additive manufacturing suppliers and how that's publicised and how we connect together those companies looking to reshore and the companies that can help them with those solutions. And that is a huge task, and that's something that I would encourage all of us to try to support. And a bigger, broader challenge is having a uniform story or narrative that can be pitched to manufacturers and to policymakers. And that, for me, is one of the enduring issues for additive manufacturing, is how to develop those convincing narratives that we can broadcast as an industry. So I'm going to draw the presentation to a close now. Thank you very much for your interest. If you have any questions, comments, criticisms, I welcome them. My email address is here. Also, a bit of a pitch here, if I may. I'm currently putting together an academic and industry consortium looking for funding, and we're working on brokering additive manufacturing to look at distributed manufacturing. So academia modelling an academic solution to this, bringing together industry and dialogue with industry. So if you and your company are interested, it's not specific to the UK, so please, if you're an international company working anywhere outside the UK, you're welcome as well. Please get in touch. And I've just included some work, some industry-facing work that I've done. I did a report on additive manufacturing. Please look at that, and then a couple of magazine articles. So please access those if you're interested in reading more. So I'll take this opportunity to thank you very much for your time, and please do get in touch. Thank you very much.